And then let's get going here. Starting with myself and a quick intro. So I've been in entertainment and IP and culture for 20 years or so now. I've always been a student of culture ever since earlier than I could articulate that, right? Ever since I was a kid, I was equally into all the verticals of culture, right? So I loved fashion as much as I loved music, as much as I loved art, and film and all of these other things. And what I've always loved is sort of bringing it all together. I started my career in traditional film and TV media, and that was at Paramount Pictures for the first several years of my career. I was able to help across all of sort of like the Paramount brands, some of the cool, sexy stuff like Transformers and Marvel and things like that. And then some of the more niche, kind of like fun, crazy stuff, SpongeBob and South Park and things like that. It was an exciting time because it was sort of the boom of sort of Web 2 and platforms. And it was the start of the transition from physical to digital media. So it was a very exciting time to be there. I was there from about 2004 to 2011 or so. During that time, I started building my first brand and business called Foundtrack. Foundtrack was initially rooted in music, but became a full service creative agency that worked across culture. And this project that we kind of just built at night and honestly built pretty badly in the early days, but it allowed us to have our personal space to do our projects. It eventually turned into this agency where we were working with Puma and Standard Hotels and a bunch of lifestyle brands and fashion brands and things like that. So I eventually left Paramount around 2011, ran Foundtrack independently till about 2013. During that time, Riot Games became a client of mine. I don't know if all of you guys are familiar with Riot, or their two biggest games, League of Legends or Valorant. But League of Legends is one of the biggest games in the world. And at the time when I joined, it was really meant to be like a competitive game. And the focus, the way that the game was built, was really to just be about competitive integrity and balance and things like that. They weren't really investing at the time in IP and creative and the universe. And so they built this small strike team. It was a small kind of R&D team called CDev, Creative Dev. And it was super fun. There was like maybe 20, 30 of us. And, you'd have a music person sitting next to a film person, sitting next to a merch person, next to an apparel person. And we'd all work together to build sort of expressions of the IP, ways of bringing the world of League of Legends to life in people's day-to-day lives. Um, and so during my time there, and I'll blaze through some of this because some of this gets into the case studies, but we were able to bring the IP to life in people's out-of-game lives through things like music, some really cool skins fantasies where we like imagine some of the champions, the characters in the games as virtual artists, right? In the way that what's cool about skins is you can kind of imagine anything and make it a reality. We turned some of the characters into like musicians, and we not only turned the characters into musicians, we actually made them music and things like that, which was super fun. Doing kind of lifestyle projects like that transcended game culture. It allowed us to start exploring things like fashion collabos and whatnot. We did a ton of live and experiential crazy performances, opening ceremonies for the big world's esports events, etc. And during the time working on those, we were able to use like very bleeding edge technology to do crazy things with like AR and holograms and all of that. Some of which to date still stands, even though it's 5 years old. Um, Still stands as like the biggest execution sort of to date. During that whole time, we were working with brands like Louis Vuitton and Bathing Ape. We were working with artists like Zed and Imagine Dragons and Becky G and cool K-pop groups like G Idol, and things like that. And so, yeah, that basically gets us to here. In 2019, I was ready to kind of make some changes and moves and things like that. When I started at Riot, it was like a 300, 400 person company. When I left, it was around 4,000. So very different type of company. And I was kind of ready for a change. What kept me there for another year was the ability to lead. Looking back on it, sort of a first in class collaboration with Louis Vuitton. So that was for me, like as a kid that kind of grew up like secretly a fashion kid or whatever. That was a dream project for me. So I got to do that at Riot. We'll get into that later. And now, flash forwarding to now, about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I co-founded Potion, and Potion's our creative studio and consultancy. We focus at the intersection of games, entertainment, and culture. And getting more specific about culture, we focus mostly on fashion collabos, and then music and music expressions. So that's my background. I grew up in DC on the East Coast. Went to high school out there. Moved out here to go to college in LA. I've stayed here ever since. Been really fortunate to travel a lot for work, and had a lot of kind of experiences around the globe and executing on the ground in multiple regions. And yeah, in the early days in college, got super involved quickly in things like the college, program board and radio station and things like that. So that's my background. And unless any questions, we'll get going. Cool. So before we get into some of the case studies that we've worked on, we wanted to share some examples of what like the early days of gaming and fashion look like. And there certainly were expressions that were happening over the years, the last 2 or 3 decades, but not nearly obviously as much as this boom that's kind of happening now. In a way, I think that when it comes to games and culture, there were three booms. The first one was the overlap of gaming and music. You really started to see that manifest in a really big way about a decade ago, but it was a long time coming. Sony had collaborated in the early days on PlayStation with a bunch of electronic music artists. Game music and electronic music overlapped in a big way. But realistically, it was starting to do these giant collaborations with folks like Zed and Imagine Dragons and stuff that really started moving the needle and started helping the music industry understand that the games industry could be one of the biggest ways for them to like launch music and do stuff. So that was about 10 years ago. About 3, 4 years ago, the idea of gaming and film and TV as a cultural vertical that started becoming more legitimate and real. If you guys recall, like a lot of like the gaming based games IP based or like movies or TV shows from 10, 20 years ago, they were horribly cringe in many cases. And the reason for that is when you think about it, there weren't folks growing up that played games and knew them authentically, that were also at the point in their careers where they were making movies and developing movies and directing movies and TV. And so now in the last couple of years, what you're seeing is you're seeing these folks that grew up playing games. They're probably now in their mid 30s or so. They've had their 10 to 15 years in the industry. And now they're the people writing, the big shows. They're directing the big shows. And that's the reason that there's been this boom in awesome gaming related film and TV media in the last couple of years, right? Arcane, the show that Netflix did, that rather Riot Games and Netflix did, that won the best animated series Emmy last year. As I'm sure a lot of you know, Last of Us has blown up and has I think 20 nominations or something like that. And yeah, fantastic show. I appreciate whoever just sent out the heart there, because that was like one of the most emotional, cool shows I've seen in a while. And not only because the show was good, but as somebody that's been in virtual entertainment and gaming and stuff for a long time, it's a really proud moment. The industry that I think has been the last to enter the fold, but is really finally understanding it, is fashion. I have a non-data driven but sort of anecdotal kind of hypothesis as to why I think gaming's been the last one. And I actually think it's based on the average age of decision makers at the companies in these industries. So in music, it's very commonplace to have, you know, 30-year-old, 35-year-old VPs, right? People that can make decisions and make budget decisions at a company. And so they were like very early to get in on gaming. Film and TV, it's a little bit older, right? You might have decision makers that are maybe 40 or so, right? Budget decision makers and things like that. Um, Fashion, at least the bigger companies, the bigger holding groups and things like that, it is a little bit older. So I think it's taken a little bit longer to really understand it. But now just seeing some of the case studies from the last couple of years, they're really getting it. And they're really getting the importance of figuring this out for multiple reasons. It's one of the biggest ways of sort of engaging with not only young people but people in general. There's a lot of I think a lot of the perception that the fashion industry had about gaming, and sort of quote unquote geek culture, anime culture, things like that, is shifting. There's a lot of people that, thanks to the internet, are like embracing their fandom and are not afraid to embrace it. And you have a lot of cool like celebrities and stuff. I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was 5 or 10 years ago, when like Michael P. Jordan, who's like this, awesome, dope actor and handsome dude, and, People's Magazine, sexiest man of the year, or whatever it is, like he claims on Twitter that he's like, like he's an anime head, or I think he was saying he's like a Yu-Gi-Oh head or something like that. And like that is like a cool legitimizer, right? And there's millions of examples of that now. So I think that perception of it being a geeky or nerdy thing is passing. So that's helping as well. So right now the fashion industry is really focused in on that. And I think we're at a really fun boom. I think we have like 10 years ahead of us of a lot of fun. So getting right into some of these examples, some of the earlier days, there was like things that were happening that were sort of dabbling, right? There was an example at the Met Gala in like 2016, where two folks on the runway were rocking like Tamagotchi eggs, right? And that was kind of like a cool nod to like the culture. And at the time, it was like a huge story, You had places that were like that. You had houses like Moschino and folks like Jeremy Scott that like were into pop art as part of their aesthetic, right? Or called pop culture as their aesthetic. So there was the Super Moschino collabo from like the 2015 or so with Mario Brothers. The fighting game community in the video game scene has always been a little bit more diverse than other parts of the gaming space, or at least used to be. And there's a lot of kind of cool street culture, urban culture that mixed in with the fighting game scene. So there was like some cool collabos like Uniqlo and things like that. Two of the most important ones from the early days to call out, though, are when Nike actually, we're living in a world now where I think we have too many collabos happening, and people are sort of like have collabo fatigue, if you will, when it comes to shoe drops and things like that. But if you go back to the early to mid 2000s, when things like the Nike, the Tiffany Dunk came out, the Diamond Supply Company Tiffany Dunk, the early like Nike Yeezys, the Nike Mag, etc., came out. These things were pretty groundbreaking at the time. And when sort of Air Force Ones and Dunks were like, in their early days of popping off as like unique drops, Nike and PlayStation actually got together. I know some of the folks that actually worked on this, and they worked on the PlayStation Nike, right? The Air Force One Low. And this is a shoe that, when you think about it, it's really cool because it's not some crazy thing that's printed with a ton of graphics. It just uses the swatch, like their colorway, in a really simple, cool way. It's funny to look at it now, and it looks like a little dated and nostalgic and stuff. But at the time, it really was like crazy and unique, and one of the first of its class things. It also is, to date, is considered sort of like a grail shoe for a lot of people. It's like, I think it's a $10,000 plus shoe. So that was a really cool kind of moment back in the day that you're seeing on the bottom right. The last one I want to point out is, even though the Louis Vuitton League of Legends collabo gets talked about a lot, and we're going to talk about it today, I want to point out that it wasn't the first time that Louis Vuitton had actually tested something in gaming. Nicolas Ghesquière, who I'm sure a lot of you know is LV's women's wear creative director, He has always like been sort of a fan, perhaps secretly, perhaps not, of sort of anime influence and gaming and things like that. And so Lightning from Final Fantasy was actually invited, the character, to be a model for LV's collection that year, sort of in 2016, I believe it was. I want to double check the dates on that, but I believe it was 2016. And it was cool. Like you'd go around a city like New York or Tokyo or whatever, and you'd see billboards, and instead of it being kind of a human model, it would be Lightning. And so, as much as people are starting to talk a lot about metaverse and virtual artists and virtual influencers in the last 2 or 3 years, it's important to point out that these concepts have been around for a long time. So that's just a little background, a couple examples, and there's certainly a lot more. Um, and unless there's any questions here, Nathan, I'll get going to this virtual artist section. Cool.
No, I think we're good so far.
Awesome. Um, so as all of you are familiar with, there's a huge boom recently, a lot of investment money kind of going into the space of virtual avatars, virtual influencers, virtual artists. The concept of virtual artists actually, like, it's funny if you were to go to like the Wikipedia for virtual artists, this concept actually started like much earlier than we think it did. Like people often refer to like Alvin and the Chipmunks as the first example of a virtual artist, basically a band or an artist that doesn't exist in the real world, that delivers music in the real world, right? Or in the case of a virtual influencer, delivers content in the real world. And so for me personally, my journey with virtual artists started with the Gorillas. Not that I worked on it, but when I was in college radio in 2001 or 2002, I received sort of a demo, like a white label demo of people trying to pitch records in the way that you used to. It was literally on a record, like a vinyl record. And I was at my office hours, I was listening to the new music for that week. And the only reason I listened to this record was it had a feature from an artist named Del the Funky Homo Sapien, who I liked. I listened to it. This track was incredible. And I looked at it and I'm like, what is this? This is crazy, this song. And it's like, it was a song by the Gorillas. And I was like, who are the Gorillas? And I looked it up on our really slow internet connection back then in the office. And I found out that the Gorillas are a virtual artist. It was right when they were debuting. Um, and I read the Wikipedia article on what is a virtual artist and blah, blah, blah. And that day, 22 years ago, it's very cheesy, but my life kind of changed because I'm like, oh my God, like I want to do this. And this combines all my loves. It combines art, music, fashion, uh, characters and storytelling, geekdom, you know what I mean? And so that for me was the start of my journey. Getting to sort of where I got to start working on this at Riot, starting in 2014 and all the way through my end there in 2019, we would take certain groups of characters in the games. The skins team thought it would be really funny to take a couple characters, for example, that were like high fantasy, right? Like metal, like things that played well with the metal space. And they were like, what if we turn a couple of the characters and we give them skins where we take like a knight or a warlock and we make them the lead singer of a metal group, right? Or a guitar player or whatever it is. And so we on the creative development team kind of linked with them and were like, well, hey, if you're going to do this, like, why don't we actually make them a record? So we actually developed them a music record. We created a whole aesthetic for them. We did like real, real printed sort of albums and sold it on iTunes, made music videos and all of these things. Um, and that was our first foray into virtual artists. But eventually we started playing with, hip hop and electronic music, and eventually pop and K-pop, and launched a project called KDA, which perhaps some of you have heard of. But if not, I'm going to take a pause here. Nathan's going to drop a link into the chat. I believe this video link is, it's about 2 minutes. So Nathan, if you could drop that link in the chat, I'd love for everyone to take a quick view of this video because it'll help contextualize better than I can. And it'll have some fun music and other things in there. And then we'll continue on in about 2 minutes. If anyone has any problems with that link, like, please let us know.
KDA is not a normal pop group. It was created by video game developer Riot Games, and its 4 members are all characters from League of Legends. But the girl group's catchy K-pop inspired tunes disguise these unusual origins, and have taken them on a journey to unlikely chart-topping success. Far more than a marketing gimmick, KDA has become a phenomenon in its own right. This is the inside story of how the studio behind League of Legends took on the music industry and created a pop sensation. KDA has amassed over 600 million views on its official YouTube videos. The group has almost 3 million monthly listeners on Spotify, has won 6 awards, and has topped the world digital song charts 3 times. With a trio of hit singles and a popular EP to its name, KDA has been a huge success for Riot Games. The story of that success starts over a decade ago. Back then, League of Legends was quickly growing into one of the most popular video games in the world. As such, it's unsurprising that the studio would want to explore other potential opportunities for the universe and its huge roster of characters. The developer's earliest moves into the scene came through creating songs for its yearly League of Legends tournament, Worlds. Each year, Riot collaborates with acts such as Imagine Dragons for the competition's huge opening show.
Awesome. All right, cool. I'm seeing some of the comments in here. It's bringing back like a lot of cool memories. I can tell a quick anecdote if you guys want. The Imagine Dragons project for me was actually one of my first 2 or 3 like projects at Riot when I started there. In our first couple months there, we're kind of creating lists of artists that could be cool to maybe collaborate with. And initially we took the approach of actually reaching out to like the labels and seeing if they just wanted to partner. And it was there were some great conversations, and we ended up working with a lot of the labels in some ways, but we didn't go the giant partnership route because we realized that they had sort of a hard time understanding it, and we realized it would be better for us to develop the music ourselves and treat ourselves as a label. Along that way, through some of our attorneys at Riot, we found out that Imagine Dragons, through their attorneys, that they were big gamers and they played games and they played League of Legends. And so I was really fortunate to be able to I was in LA at the time, got to fly to New York and meet them. And everybody kind of like hit it off pretty quickly between Riot and the Imagine Dragons team. And we'd play games with them, we do all this stuff, and the project sort of birthed itself in a really natural way. And was somebody here that said that they remember listening to music and not realizing it was a game related thing. I think that is really key with any expression that we did of the IP. A personal philosophy I had was that we had to make sure that anything we were doing, whether it was music, apparel, a music video, it needed to compete not with other gaming content, but with other content in the category they were trying to disrupt, right? So like if we're making a song, the song needed to be as good as anything on somebody's Spotify. If we're making a music video, it needs to be as good as any music video. If we're making a show, it needs to be as good as the Super Bowl show. If we're making clothes, they had to be as cool as anything else you wear. So that was awesome, and it was super fun. Yeah, and so that was kind of like how that started, and like I said, we got to work with a lot of cool artists. The takeaway there is, I think, is not only find artists of a certain craft level when you work with them. It could be a musician, it could be a designer, it could be anything, but make sure you try and work with folks that also like have some some cultural kind of overlap or interest overlap, and it can really help things often. Um, okay, cool. Let me go on here. Okay, cool. Then KDA, that video teed it up really nicely. But it was super fun project for us. We got to do everything from our executive team at Riot was really generous with us, but then had a lot of trust in us, and so we really got to pick characters that we felt matched the archetypes, of a pop group really well. This character in the middle, for example, Evelyn, in the game, she's like a demon succubus. She'll like literally, seduce and kill you, before she turns into her demon form. So as we were thinking of a pop group, we're like, okay, that could actually play well with the concept of like a diva, right? Like every group has the diva, right? Um, like a Kali, this character on the bottom left of the billboard, she's like an assassin, right? So we're like, and she moves super quickly, and we're like, that would be an amazing like MC or like battle rapper for the group. And so it was super fun to develop it in that sense. We got to build mood boards for each character where we're pulling like fashion references and things like that we liked. We were able to bring this to life and debut it live on stage, as you're seeing on the bottom right, at the League of Legends World Championship in 2018, which was in Seoul. The year before that, it was at Staples Center in LA, where we had Zed. The year after that, it was at the Bird's Nest in China. And the year following that, we had it in Paris. So what we did was we created the characters, designed them. We developed an original song on their first record called Pop Stars. Our concept was, and this is kind of maybe a cool takeaway for you guys too, is I have a strong belief that in order to break the rules, you need to understand the rules, right? So you need to understand your fundamentals and practice your fundamentals so you know how to break the rules. Breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules rarely works, I think. Virgil Abloh has a cool had a cool concept. The late great, he had a concept of, I believe it's called the 3% rule, and he believed that if you truly understand something on a deep level, that you really only need to change it about 3% to take it in a completely new direction. I think you could argue the sort of percentage there a little bit, but I think that was a really cool takeaway. So when it came to this, we knew that we were fans of pop music. We also knew that we were fans of K-pop music, and we were wondering why K-pop hadn't really broken through. Obviously, 6 years later now it's broken through. But for us, one of our hypotheses was that if we were to able to like do a hybrid language song, English and Korean, that could probably break through pretty well. And if we built a group of featured artists that were like mixed around the globe, that would help a lot. And so by combining sort of the IP, combining a lot of authenticity and love, we launched this thing, and we were just humbled at the response. Like, I actually like, crazy, not to like whatever, it's just surreal, but I have this is literally like a platinum record for that project and stuff. And so the potential is endless. Years about 2 years after I left Riot did a follow-up to this. They have an EP. I'm sure there's more stuff coming out. And the reason we're sharing this in a fashion presentation is it allowed us to take our first steps into working on fashion collabos. The following year, following when we launched KDA, by the way, following this, I'm going to have Nathan put together share this deck, either this deck or like a redacted version of this deck. So we'll get this out to your program admin to share with everybody. And then two, Nathan, if you could just make like a small list of links to include in the email body of some of the more detailed stuff for this, the performances and stuff like this, in case anyone wanted to catch up on it. The following year, obviously this project was huge. It was one of Riot's biggest skin lines. It got tons of press. The fans loved it, et cetera, et cetera. Our leaders wanted us to follow up and invest more deeply in music. What was cool was, once again, they had a lot of trust in us. And instead of being like, you guys have to make KDA 2, they're like, come up with something and pitch it to us. So what we did was we came up with this concept that Akali, she's the rapper in KDA, that this is a narrative concept we came up with. We came up with this idea that like, she was torn she was sort of emotionally torn with the idea that she was in a pop group. Some of her early fans from like the hip hop scene were calling her a sellout, and she was wondering if it was like too glossy and not real enough. So we came up with this idea that when she was off cycle on KDA, that she ran her own label and like streetwear line called True Damage. Okay. And True Damage is like a term from the game, but we also thought it could sound dope as like a name of like a label or whatever. As you guys know, like industries continue to collide and merge, right? So like starting about 10 years ago with like Odd Future and some other examples, oftentimes like a collective is both a label and a streetwear line, right? It's Pizza Slime and a bunch of others. And so we came up with this concept of True Damage. It's her label and her kind of fashion line. We were able to introduce a bunch more characters into it. And this year was it was wild. We did this performance in Paris. We were able to bridge this into collaborations with Louis Vuitton and Bathing Ape, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this not only allowed us to work with more artists, we worked with Kiki Palmer, Becky G, continue to work with G Idol, the K-pop group, worked with two American rappers, Thutmose and Duckworth, and really kind of take it in sort of a new direction. So this was True Damage, and we debuted this in Paris in 2019. So once again, Nathan will include this in a summary. Okay, so that gets us to here, to the Louis Vuitton League of Legends collabo, and Inga, thank you for the that note in the thing. I definitely recommend when Nathan shares the links later, or if you just do your own search, if you type in 2019 League of Legends opening ceremony, the performance for True Damage will come up. I think that 2019 might have been peak ceremony. I know Riot's got some cool stuff probably cooked up for this year when they're going back to Korea, so everyone should tune in. But I think that 2019 was peak ceremony, and I think the reason it was the culmination of us really learning how to do these crazy performances. It was a culmination of us learning how to do music, apparel, all sorts of things, and I think it came together very beautifully in that performance, and we were able to do some crazy stuff with holograms. I believe at the time it was like one of the biggest executions of like a hologram HoloNet setup ever. Yeah, Nathan just posted it here. You guys can check that out later. But it was bigger than the basketball court at the arena. So it was totally bananas. We were doing all sorts of like illusions and things like that, and it was super fun. Okay, so does anybody have any questions before I move on? All right. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so Louis Vuitton League of Legends was really like the first giant foray into like gaming and fashion that we embarked on at Riot and that I was able to work on. The way this came together was actually in a couple different ways, and it was super unique. There was a colleague of mine, a guy named Alban Deschalais. He is now the CEO of one of the biggest esports teams in the world, G2 Esports. He had a long career in partnerships and business development, and he headed up business development for Europe. And one day he gave a sort of a ping, like a message to myself and a woman named Naz, who headed up global partnerships for Riot. And he let us know that Louis Vuitton had reached out and that they were interested in a conversation. And he asked us if we could give a tour. And we were like, of course, we'll give them a tour. I was like, I got goosebumps and stuff like that. And like super prepared for that and craziness. And so we took them around Riot, kind of showed them our world. They told us about their world. Louis Vuitton has a tradition of, and they have a slogan called Victory Travels in Louis Vuitton. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar or have seen it, but they've done trophy cases for major global sports. The World Cup trophy travels in a Louis Vuitton trunk. The Rugby World Cup, the Tour de France, the Monaco GP, et cetera, et cetera. So they have this tradition, and as you know, they have a tradition of trunk making and serious craft in that regard. And so what they'd actually approached us on initially, the collaboration really grew in scale over time very quickly. But what they initially reached out to us on was a collaboration to do a bespoke trunk for the Summoners Cup. The Summoners Cup is the trophy for League of Legends, and so we jumped on the opportunity. They ended up being a really dope partner. A little lesson and takeaway for everyone here is when it comes to partnership and collaboration, I'm going to say something that's going to sound obvious, but unfortunately, I think it's forgotten quite often, which is I think good collaboration yields an output that neither party could have made on their own, but shares some common DNA, right? And I think that when it's a collaboration comes out that either party could have done on their own, it ends up feeling lazy or empty. And I think that fans and consumers can really read through that stuff. So just kind of keep that in mind. For us, there was obviously a lot of differences, right? These are two worlds that on paper should not be able to collide. A lot of people would have had doubts. But what we were able to find our common language in was in our love of craft. We both took craft very seriously. We took art very seriously. That was a common language we found. One of the things that we had to be very careful about was that when you think about Louis Vuitton, they're a very inaccessible brand. They're very it's prestigious, to be candid, expensive, limited. And then gaming is in many ways the most ubiquitous and the most open and kind of easily accessible thing. You know what I mean? Low, generally speaking, a low cost of entry, and it's very it's for everyone. And so we're like, how do we solve that? And what we did was with a lot of like sort of the in-game executions, the in-game items, we made them very exclusive, limited, but we gave them the opportunity for any player to be able to earn them, if they played enough or they were, they accomplished certain things and whatnot. So kind of getting back to the trophy case, we worked on the trophy case with Louis Vuitton. It was 3 or 4 different parties were involved in sort of crafting this in a brainstorm session at Louis Vuitton one day. It was myself. It was the founder of Possible Productions, a guy named Michael Figge. I don't know if anyone in this group is sort of like a Web3 degen or like a metaverse head or whatever. But Figge is probably best known in this space in Web3 as the founder of 10KTF and We Knew Labs, which about a year ago was acquired by Yuga Labs, and now Figge is the chief creative officer of Yuga Labs. Anyway, Figge was one of my first calls. Figge's and his company Possible had always, as the name implies, they believe anything's possible. And anytime we'd come up with a crazy idea, they would be the ones that would help us like realize it. They're dope. You should check out their portfolio. They do a lot of work in fashion and music. They still work with Riot and work on things like their Valorant champions and stuff like that. So to kind of fast forward here, what started off as this collaboration to do this trunk, it was this cool thing that was, a physical trunk and had, canvas and leather and all these things that comes from the Louis Vuitton world. But it also had digital screens on the side where we're programming content and things like that. There was a mechanical element to it. And all of this stuff kind of came together, and a bunch of different like partners and vendors came together to help build this. Louis Vuitton's craftspeople at the original home of Louis Vuitton, which is now a craft shop for bespoke trunks. They worked on all of the leather and canvas workings on this. This cool company called Kickmaker that does crazy mechanical things built the motorized functions of this. Possible did all the screens content, perfect, etc. And so initially this started as a collaboration for the trunk, but we were able to steal a little move from like Steve Jobs, and we did at the end of the tour we did the little like one more thing kind of thing, and they were huge fans of KDA, they were aware of it, and we gave them a little bit. This is in early 2019. And this was a very short timeline, but I think it came together because both parties really believed in it. At the beginning of 2019, when they came in for this tour, we gave them a preview of what we were thinking of for True Damage. And so the long and short of it, I'm skipping a lot here, but basically the opportunity arose to collaborate with Nicolas Ghesquier, their women's wear creative director. And what we did was we took two of the characters in the game. What was really fun were they were actually both of them were new characters. Kiana, who you're seeing on the top left, and Senna, who you're seeing on the top right. And Nicolas Guesquier and his team designed their looks for both of them. And actually, all of these pieces are pieces that were featured in his collections from that year. And what was cool was at the time that these characters came out, the pieces were yet to debut. They debuted like a few weeks or months later in the shows. So that was a very surreal experience to be able to meet them and work with them. And I have this distinct memory of being in like the design studio with them, and they're like showing us materials and stuff and asking, they're like handing me some like very expensive looking jeweled garment to like touch it and be like, what do you think of this? I'm like, I don't even want to touch this because if I break it, it's very expensive and stuff like that. But no, it was super fun and crazy. So the collection or the project kind of manifested itself in multiple ways. We had the out of game experience with the trunk and the capsule collection, which had several garments and accessories and things like that. It had the in-game execution, which was the characters and the skins, which could be unlocked. And then finally, the one that kind of brought it all together was that performance that lived kind of between both worlds. And actually, sort of fast forwarding to around the time that the following year when Riot decided to do the follow-up to KDA, because of this DNA, because of this narrative that we created and familiarity with the fashion industry, more and more fashion publications, in addition to music publications, picked up on the story. And this was a really cool and like kind of proud moment. But like Elle magazine did an editorial feature that featured KDA in doing like an editorial fashion shoot. And it was so cool because it was like, they're wearing Louis Vuitton, they're wearing Bottega Veneta, and several others. And so if you guys look up, I believe it was Elle magazine Singapore or something, it was super dope. So once again, Nathan will share that, and this has a bunch of links and things like that. The collaboration sold out pretty quickly in a majority of regions. Publications were and press was like incredible. And to this date, I still think it's one of the biggest case studies to date. And the reason I think that it's held up is I think one, a lot of love went into it. And I know that's sort of a bit esoteric, but what I mean by that is like a lot of like craft expertise and passion went into it. And we thought about not only like what is the product, right? Or what's the quote unquote art, but how is it that we're going to release it? We really thought about the marketing plan the whole time while we were developing the product. And that's another maybe lesson or takeaway for everybody is as you're developing things, it's okay for certain things to be very, like, say, avant-garde, right? If over here on the left you have like fully avant-garde and niche, and over here you have fully mainstream, it's okay for any of you guys as like creators to decide where on that scale you want to be, but also manage your expectations based on where on that scale you want to be. It's very rare, for example, right, that a super avant-garde thing can get big, you have to, there's like the rare exceptions, maybe it's like an Ambush or something, or a or Rick Owens or whatever it might be. And over here you have the super mainstream, and you might be able to be less artistically expressive, but you can get scale. I personally I like playing somewhere here where it's like I like pushing the mass to the weirdest place possible is kind of what I like to do. But just kind of keep that in mind and remember that as you're as sort of you're designing things and working on things, regardless of where on that scale you want to be. Though you do have to think about not only what is my product, but how am I going to release my product as you're developing it. And the more that you can loop in folks from like marketing and PR and communications early, the more that they're going to want to help you, because it's not like you're asking for help last minute. They're going to feel like more like they're part of the team. And that's another reason that I think this execution really worked, was we really made every department that worked on this project, both at Riot and Louis Vuitton, feel like they were part of the project for the entire year that we were developing it. So everyone took a lot of pride in it when it was released and came out. I won't spend too much time on this one, but basically, the following year when we did the True Damage project, it was super dope. We got to collaborate with Bathing Ape and their second line A Ape. I'm actually wearing one of the things from it right now. That was super fun because for me growing up, Bathing Ape and Nigo was like a huge influence and stuff like that. And so that was super dope. And we started working on it in like 2018, 19, and it actually came out the year after I left Riot. So it was really proud and cool to see that happen. As you can see on the bottom right, there was some cool ways that were like not tacky of sort of bringing in-game branding branding into the game. And so that was cool. So that's what you're seeing here. On this one, what was really cool was the campaign featured both real world models and the virtual characters themselves modeling stuff. So that was fun. And, not everything, a reminder to everybody, just because you have technology, like you don't have to use technology for the sake of using technology. There's a great Steve Jobs video from right when he came back to Apple where he talks about that. And he says that you should always figure out like what is the goal and like what does your consumer want or your fan want, or what do you want to give your fan, and then work backwards from there. And if there's a place for technology in it, use it, but don't force it. So the example here is, for example, yeah, we could have done this with some crazy like mocap 3D thing or whatever, but in this case, we just shot dummy models and did like just a traditional face replacement, in other cases, when we're doing a live broadcast show, yeah, it made sense for us to do like full, 3D design and animation and mocap and AR and everything like that. So always kind of pick your medium based on what you're trying to achieve. So let me take a pause here because I'm going to take 10 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, to talk about some current case studies and current things in the market, and then leave the last 25 minutes for Q&A and everything. Before I do that, is there any questions on sort of the Louis Vuitton stuff or any of the virtual artist stuff? Okay, cool. Yeah, so right here, we just wanted to share a couple examples of things that have been happening post KDA, post Louis Vuitton, League of Legends. There have been some really cool expressions, and to me, any collaboration, any expression that makes it into the market, whether it's a small indie project, whether it's something from a major brand, I love them all because I think they're all sort of a net positive. Even the bad ones, we learn things from them. I also, the older I get and having had to work on a variety of projects, I have a lot of respect for anybody that's able to like start anything and get it done, because that in and of itself is hard. And I encourage everyone to start things and get stuff out, even if it's bad. For the first 10, 15 years of my career, as I was like learning, I was just doing stuff, and a lot of it was bad, looking back on it, but I was able to learn a lot. So anyway, these are just, we pulled Tori, who's sitting here with me. I don't know if you can see her. That's Tori over there. Pulled a bunch of examples of cool stuff that's happened in the last couple of years. There was the Gucci sort of Xbox collabo where they did like a custom Xbox and a case for it. Animal Crossing really popped off for anybody that was part of the pandemic, which is probably everybody. A lot of us were like living in Animal Crossing when that happened. So that was cool to see that collabo. Minecraft obviously is popping off, and it was cool to see what Lacoste did. Pretty recently, there's this really cool Palladium and Destiny collabo that I thought was pretty dope. I don't know if you guys are familiar with, I want to point out a brand called Bait. It's a series of streetwear shops around the world. I think they have like 10 locations in the US and Asia. And what might have initially started as your traditional sort of streetwear store where you went to get the cool like drop of the week or whatever, the cool Nike drop of the week or whatever. These folks were really smart, and I think they took like a lot of their revenue and they reinvested it in doing license deals with IPs that were sort of like geek culture IPs, anime IPs, video game IPs like Street Fighter, and they saw that there was an opportunity space that no one was that no one was really leveraging, and they've really become one of the front runners in sort of the drops for that are at the intersection of gaming and anime. So definitely check out Bait. Um, these were a couple other cool things. What's interesting is you see some very like traditional brands, if you will, Burberry, Ralph Lauren. They're doing some experimenting, right? And there's certainly like pain points sometimes in working with brands like this. It's a very different culture, but you are able to find a middle ground and do cool stuff. This image you're seeing on the top left in the middle, this is actually one of our good friends and clients, G2 Esports. They're one of the biggest esports organizations in the world. For a scale comparison, the Lakers front office, the Los Angeles Lakers basketball team, their front office is like 60, 70 people, I believe. And G2, their front office is like 150 folks, right? So if we're going to talk about scale, it's crazy. They have teams across, they have really competitive teams across a bunch of games like League of Legends and Valorant and Counter-Strike and things like that. But they've done some really cool collabos with Adidas. They currently have a really amazing collaboration with Ralph Lauren. That's what you're seeing in the middle. On their owned line, which they do themselves, they release jerseys every year. This year, I thought it was cool because they leaned into the League of Legends World Championship is going to be in Korea, and baseball is like huge in Korea. And there's something about like a classic like pinstripe like Yankees style uh, uh, baseball jersey that's kind of a lot more unique than some of those like the very generic jerseys sometimes you see in sort of like esports and sports in general. So they've had a lot of success with that. And what was fun for them on that one was they were able to do like a crazy, like funny K-pop campaign with it, where they're like sort of turning the guys in the esports team into a K-pop group unsuccessfully. So it was kind of fun and funny. Gentle Monster, who I'm sure you guys are might be familiar with, particularly if you're into like crazier design and stuff. They do really cool eyewear and optics, and have locations in the U.S. and Asia and whatnot. They did a sick collabo with Overwatch. So yeah, and then lastly, one of the things, as I mentioned, and the part of the reason we're taking part in this program is we find a lot of like soul nourishment in sharing knowledge and trying to be as generous as we can with sharing knowledge. I personally take a lot of joy in teaching. So we do a lot of work with a couple colleges. We work with USC in LA, Otis College of Design, Santa Monica College. We're trying to do more international stuff like this. And Otis College of Design in LA, in particular, their fashion department and their head of their fashion department, Jill Zelnick, she is really ahead of the curve. She believes that Otis, while I believe their students have a very high degree of artistry, she believes that it's important that they not only have artistry, but a practical skill set when they enter the market. So she brought us on to advise her and her department on emerging technologies, gaming, etc. And so this is really cool. Jill put together a collaboration with Activision Blizzard, and the students were able to design into an aesthetic that was inspired by a couple of Activision's games, including Diablo, Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, and several others. And once again, Nathan can provide a link to Otis's site where I believe they have like sort of a retrospective on there. And so we were able to advise that program. It was super fun. Yeah, and then lastly, I just actually dropped these in this morning because I thought about it. I mentioned Figgy and his project 10KTF earlier. If you guys aren't familiar with 10KTF, I recommend you to check it out. I also warn you because you might fall down a rabbit hole. It's probably one of the best ARGs or alternate reality games or storytelling things I've ever seen. It's all centered around this. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here, but there's this old Japanese man, Wagmi-san, who is the artisan of the metaverse, and he you can take your characters to him, your PFPs, and he designs apparel for them. And there's like this whole narrative storytelling universe they've built around it. This example on the left is Alessandro Michele from Gucci, who was formerly with Gucci. This is a couple months ago. They released a collaboration together where they brought Alessandro Michele into the world of 10KTF, and it yielded an output which was virtual apparel for your characters or your PFPs, and then also in the physical world, holders and participants got some physical goods and things like that. Lastly, I highly recommend you guys look up, Nathan, if you could maybe find this article. I was able to find it on Google News. There's a company called IYK. If you type in, like, I think it was like IYK investment or IYK A16Z into Google News, it came up. Just yesterday or 2 days ago, this company IYK that focuses on connected apparel, they create the NFC chips and, more importantly, the enterprise software behind it, to make garments for, Billionaire Boys Club, 90cc, several others. They just got a massive investment round from led by A16Z. It was like 18 million, which, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, we're not living in sort of a bull market. We're potentially headed to like a pretty major global recession. And investment dollars are not what they were several years ago. So to get an $18 million round in this economy, it's a huge nod. And what they're doing is dope. We know these guys pretty well. Definitely recommend checking it out. And I think that in the future, most of our garments will, or at least higher end garments at a minimum, will have ways of authenticating their authenticity built into the garment. Whether you know it or not, a lot of your garments might already have them. So that's interesting. It also opens up, worthwhile conversation around privacy and all of that as well. But I think we're going to see a lot of precedent-setting discussions when it comes to ethics and all of that around some of this stuff in the future. There's so many other topics that we can talk about, but I'll save that for the questions portion. We didn't get into AI and the design process at all, or several other topics. But before we get into the Q&A, we just want to say thank you and thanks for having us. And thanks for everybody for inviting us to be part of this program. Special shout out to Danny from Drop, who I believe was probably the one that connected the dots here. She's amazing. Danny Loftus, if you guys don't know her, and thank you to Drop and Vertical and everything. So with that, thank you to my team, Nathan and Tori, for helping put this awesome presentation together. And let's hit up any questions or anything like that.
Fantastic. Most likely, people will be dropping their questions through the chat channel on the side of this voice. So if you don't mind putting that up.
Yeah, for sure. Let me, I'll open that up and keep an eye on it. Let me scan a little bit. Oh yeah.
I'm happy just to ask a question if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, and feel free to just unmic and ask questions as well. Either way, however you want to do it.
Yeah. Firstly, I wanted to say your work is insane. It's phenomenal how many spaces you went into and the clarity that you created. And there's a quote that you mentioned. I've also heard Virgil's quote. That's amazing. But the quote you mentioned was, or the thing that you focus on is getting the expertise first and then breaking. I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but I wanted to ask. Go on, yeah.
Knowing the rules to break the rules, Yeah.
Perfect. And I strongly agree with that. Question what I wanted to ask, what softwares would you say, like, us in this residency should focus on mastering and then breaking the rules if we're looking at it from a fashion gaming perspective?
Yeah. Nathan, I'd love for you to also unmic here and feel free to add some perspective here. I very much will own my position as I am strong as like an executive producer, like an executive creative director. I do understand enough about craft where I'll share a couple tools that I think you guys should keep your eyes on. I think that the more specific answer there is it really depends on like where you're trying to focus. Like if you're trying to focus on concept art versus animation versus design versus compositing versus whatever, it could kind of it can run the gamut. I'll give a broad answer. Nathan might chime in, and then from there, if any of you guys want to get really deep, feel free to like contact us through the administrators of this program, you know what I mean, with specific questions, and we can probably connect you with specific craft experts. Like But a couple things that I've been saying recently, I definitely say keep an eye on Unreal Engine. They are investing heavily they're obviously completely adopted as a game engine, but increasingly they're investing significant dollars into it becoming an animation engine. And you're already seeing, at least from an environment design standpoint, you're seeing it become like a front runner. Obviously, it's used in a lot of film and TV in volumetric kind of capture. And also, I believe we'll start to see it used in a lot of fashion shows and things like that. You don't necessarily character design or character animate in Unreal, but I wouldn't be surprised if those tool sets become better in the future. As for I'll mention a bucket, which is just like AI tools in general. Just like geek out hard on all the AI tools, play with all of them. I think the one thing that I'll say where you have to be careful is a lot of the bigger companies won't touch them just yet because there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether the outputs of AI tools are actually owned by you or might be owned by somebody else. So keep that in mind, but be very aware of them. As for kind of like other sort of like day-to-day kind of tools in the space. Nathan, do you want to throw out a couple? I'm happy to kind of like in a follow-up email include a bunch too.
Yeah, I mean, you said about Unreal, definitely the most important thing here. Like there's just a plethora of 3D software. Like I think you just need to understand what the line of the 3D is. So like if you're going from concept to 3D, like what are the limitations of materials? Most likely in Unreal, but there's kind of like a middle step in between those with like Brush and Maya and all that. But just understanding the overall like boundaries of what 3D can and can't do is important. And for me, for AI, I like to think of it as like a thinking partner or like a creative ideation partner. So using it to kind of help you do what you're already doing, which is kind of like stealing like an artist, right? You're aggregating different inspirations. Use it to help you imagine what those things look like, and I think that is kind of like the best use case for that.
Totally. And yeah, I mean, I honestly, if we just started listing like a lot of the tools, I think we'd get in too much of a rabbit hole right now. But obviously, there's like things like ZBrush and Blender and a ton of stuff out there. But yeah, I would say happy to take any like specific suggestions of like where maybe certain tool sets are going, because we certainly know craft experts in all the spaces. So I believe it was Joyce. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, thank
Awesome.
you.
Great.
Another chat here.
Nathan, by the way, your voice level is really low, so maybe either just like talk a little bit louder in the mic or maybe just crank your gain a little bit. Okay, so here's a question. For someone who enjoys working with code, programming, is there any space for coding in creating fashion and gaming, or is the whole pipeline mainly in 3D software? I would say certainly yes. A couple examples. That project I mentioned, taking a look at the 10KTF project. One of the reasons that project does so well that nobody credits is that their tech is just amazing. It's bulletproof. All their experiences just work, and their code is super efficient. I don't want to get too into like proprietary things, but I know when Figgy went over to Yuga Labs and his team, they started re-outputting a lot of their assets and rebuilding sort of the code of them to make them more efficient at fashion shows, and doing a lot of these newer things, these experiential things, these hologram things, etc. Oftentimes, it's not that the whole thing is that complicated to develop. You're working with, say, 10 crafts that are not that complicated, or 10 pieces of technology that are not that complicated. But what is very complicated is stringing them together and bringing them together. And that's often done in really smart and efficient programming code and that sort of thing. So I think there's certainly opportunities. What I would say is the more niche you get, be careful, because it's not like there's like I don't know if there's like a fashion design coding industry as such. So you might need to like make sure you're learning your fundamentals in another industry and then bringing them over to this industry. But there's certainly opportunities. The other thing too is when it comes to authenticating of goods, in terms of fashion companies being focused on emerging technologies, most of the major holding groups, LVMH and Kering and everybody, they have innovation teams where I literally know people that are coders that work for Louis Vuitton and stuff like that, right? So I do think that there's a lot of opportunities there. I think that was from Gen Art Studio. Hopefully that answers your question, but let us know if not. Nathan, do you want to tee up another question, or was there another one from? Okay, cool.
There was one earlier. Did you answer it already from Celine?
No. Do you mind reading that one?
Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
She said, what are the challenges you have faced when collaborating with gaming brands in brainstorming and bridging your storytelling with the already existing lore and abilities of the characters? How do you handle risk management in projects like that?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think there's two ways to look at that. You could already be an expert on the IP that you're working on. And if that's the case, it's going to be easier. If you're not, you have to commit to doing your research, doing your homework, learning about your partner. A lot of like partnerships or a lot of development of IP and translating one IP into a new medium or one character into a new medium is about really understanding it. And a lot of it is, I say that it's almost like being a translator. You have to learn how to like bridge worlds. So you have to commit to like learning about it. And just, it's okay to not be an expert on something. Just fill the room with experts, right? And you have to have almost an irrational belief that anything's possible, and just break the development phase into a few different phases. Make the very first phase a very organized brainstorm, but a very blue sky brainstorm where nothing is a bad idea. At the early brainstorm, like give enough structure so you can run it, but have enough people there where you can have a wide variety of ideas, and then kind of take it down from there. So we got into like a lot of art. Like, dude, there's like a huge team of people working on this stuff. A lot of people get credit for these things. And we get into all sorts of arguments about, is it authentic for a Kali to act this way as a rapper versus this way based on her character, or would Evelyn actually do this or not? And there's no right or wrong answer here, right? These are all like fictional characters or whatnot, right? And so it's once again learning the fundamentals and then going with a combination of instinct and being humble enough to, I think, like listen to other folks and get their take and be really honest about when you're an expert or not. Okay. Cool. Hopefully, I'm seeing question from Alexa. Hi, I'm currently doing my thesis on gaming and luxury fashion, so I would love to know your opinion about the lack of interoperability between platforms. Do you think this will be a limitation for them to enhance their meta commerce? Okay, so that's a big question, and it's a question I've gotten asked before. I think that we will have some amount of interoperability in the future, but not as much as soon as we think we will. It's a much more complicated discussion point because there's two sides to consider. There's the technological side of it, which I actually think is going to be the easier side of it. A lot of the technology is already starting to exist. I think whoever can create the best interface for it and will sort of win. We have a couple more years to go on that front. I think the more complicated side of it is, for this stuff to work, we need some bigger examples of it, stuff that people really love, right? Fashion collections or characters or whatever it might be, IPs that people love. the issue is the ones that people love are generally bigger and they're valuable. And the owners of those IPs don't necessarily always want to make those things interoperable, right? They want to control their wall garden. They want to have if you're stealing like a business term, like a defensible moat, right, around their product and things like that. I think that interoperability will probably actually start in like gaming, maybe social media a little bit. And you're seeing things like I get that this isn't the dream state interoperability that like Web3 futurists maybe believe in, but like for example, I think like Fortnite's an interesting example of you know Fortnite being able to have multiple brands in it and more importantly multiple IPs. If you were to tell somebody at Epic or Riot Games in 2010 that a Riot Games character would appear in an Epic game, like that would be a non-starter for discussion. Do you know what I mean? Like that, or it would be highly unlikely. But now you're seeing that, like, when Riot releases Arcane, the TV show, they take a character from Arcane, the TV show, which is also a character in League of Legends, and they allow them to be in Fortnite, right, as a promotional vehicle or something like that. So that's like it's not the perfect example, but I do think that that it's a baby step in the right direction. So to reframe and summarize my answer, I think that like via technology and just making the process as easy as possible to bring multiple IPs or assets together, we could see a solve in that regard. But I think the blocker is actually going to be to get IP holders or owners of assets or patents to want their things to be sort of interoperable. Some of that might prove to just be unprotectable by them in the future too. But all of these things kind of come together to kind of support kind of my answer here. I know that was a very broad response, but it was also very, it's a big question you're asking and a good question. So, all right, looks like we have about 5 minutes. Yeah, I think we can go like 10 minutes over. Do we have a 10:30? No? Yeah, I mean, if there are more questions, we can go probably up to 10 more minutes past 11 a.m. But if not, we can also wrap up. Yeah, feel free. Like take your opportunity here. Like ask some weird questions, some hard questions, like whatever it is. Like I don't pretend to have the right answer to a lot of this stuff. That's the thing about like emerging technologies or emerging creative or artistic spaces, is that some of the answers don't exist. While we're kind of waiting to see if there's more questions, another sort of like unsolicited kind of professional tip I'll share. I often get asked at these things like, what, do you have any tips for leadership, or do you have any tips for me if I want to become a product owner or a executive producer or creative director or whatever? And what I'll say is I can give you craft advice on anything, or I can connect you with a craft expert. But oftentimes, like these days, you can just go on YouTube, right, for like craft expertise. I think the real world, sort of how the world works versus how the world should work, kind of advice is almost more valuable. And one of the things I'll say about sort of like owning a product, being a leader, etc., is the part that no one really tells you about is how difficult it is when you have to be the person in the room that maybe makes the hard call, or makes the call that no one believes in, or it might be a call that might require everybody on the team to have to do more work, or do more work last minute, or be against the grain or whatever, right? There might be times you have to fight for more budget, or figure out how to raise more money to do something. So keep that in mind as you go down this journey. That stuff is difficult. I think that you can have people disagree with you, but still be respectful to them. So keep that in mind as well. But that's going to be the harder part of the job. And I think that's what separates people that are really willing to be product owners or creators or leaders or whatever. So yeah. And then, yeah, as Inga mentioned, feel free to just unmute and ask questions as well. Ooh, footwear and Web3. I'm very passionate about this topic. So Joyce asks, I make footwear in Gravity Sketch. What types of things could I do in the future with footwear and Web3? I think there's a lot there. So there's several, virtual IPs and storytelling ecosystems in Web3. I repeatedly point back at 10KTF, I think, as one of the best ones. To give a little context on 10KTF, so we're sort of mid-pandemic. Figgy as a leader is somebody that's very cool because he's not only has like sort of broad leadership experience, but he's got a lot of hands-on technical experience himself. He's a really good 3D artist. So just as kind of like a joke or for fun or whatever it was, right in the beginning of 2021 when Clubhouse was popping off and NFTs were first starting to pop off and stuff, like as friends of his were getting into the space, he would just, as like a homie, he would just like ask you to send you his PFP or your virtual identity, and then he would take it and he would wrap it on a 3D model of a shoe. You know what I mean? Like an Air Force One type shoe or whatever it was. And he would just, people would post these on social media and people would DM him requesting them. All of a sudden, next thing you know, he's getting, one day he wakes up and he has like 300 people asking for this. And then he's like, wait, there might be something here. And then that's kind of what gave them the idea for like 10KTF, right? Which has a bunch of cool footwear things. The other thing is another word that I personally hate a lot of buzzwords just because they become a little cliche or cringe after a while. I've never really liked the word phygital, but I like the concept of phygital, which is basically things that both have a digital and a physical sort of manifestation, and things that have a manifestation at the intersection of physical and digital. I really, as somebody that I might be like stereotyped as or misrepresented as a flag waver of virtual experiences. I've certainly worked on virtual experiences, but I really don't believe in fully virtual experiences. I'm not sure if people even really crave them. I think we're very far away from them, to be completely honest. I think it's things that can make your day-to-day life better, whether that's virtual or real, and your connection to other humans better. I think that's what people are wanting, and I think that's where opportunity lies. So when it comes to like footwear, I think things that like cross the intersection of virtual footwear and real footwear, like that to me is a win. Any projects where like something that I have a virtual object of or that I could put in a game, right? Or wear it on the skin of mine or something in a game that I can also wear in the real world. Like I think that's cool. There's obviously all the stuff that experiments that Nike is doing with their acquisition of Artifact. There's like things there. There's I'm only talking about some of the bigger ones, but there's like a lot of smaller examples too, of things you can do. And yeah, Joyce, I think that there's a lot of opportunities where you're going to see a lot of games have not only just like a full body skin that you can equip with your character, but individual garments, right? Like shoes and things like that. So I think there's a lot there. I am also a phygital activist, even though I don't like the word phygital. So yeah, definitely reach out. Nathan, did you want to? Oh yeah, and then Nathan certainly on our team is probably even more of has his sort of hand his finger to the pulse of sort of like what's happening not only in gaming, but he's probably our resident DGen on the team. I'm certainly a DGen myself, but Nathan's probably the deepest there. So feel free to reach out to him as well. And he's involved in a lot of cool like indie projects and things like that too.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for interoperable stuff in the future as well, or interoperable gaming. I think, like you said, we're still really far away from that. But I think, eventually in a perfect world, you'd be able to distribute your digital shoes and maybe even use the downloads of that design for a proof point to make it into a real thing.
If somebody can create like some sort of bridge or pipeline that okay, like when you look back at like 2000, I might be butchering the dates here, like the mid 2000s. If any of you have read the Steve Jobs book, one of the most interesting things is when they talk about the advent of the iPod and what actually got the iPod and the iTunes store to work. It's not that it was a device to play music, it was that it was a store to buy music in a new way, right? To buy singles versus buy albums. And to do that, how did that happen? It happened by on the back end, he had to go get the major labels to all agree to this. So if some technology developer, maybe it's a startup that gets acquired by a bigger company or has their own growth path, like an IYK type company. Maybe it's something within, a Google or a Meta or whatever. If somebody builds like some sort of framework, a pipe that laterally allows multiple games to connect with it, that they can get the buy-in and the sign-off of multiple game developers, that it's safe, it protects their IP, and then allows fashion brands, the Nikes of the world, apparel brands of the world, to basically be able to create designs that then get ported over to like multiple ecosystems. I think that's a way this stuff could happen. I don't think it's going to necessarily just happen like organically, if you will. If it does happen sort of quote unquote organically, that'll happen sort of in the indie game space where they can be more risky and they can all kind of, I don't know, just try things and call each other and, you know what I mean, make stuff happen more quickly. So I think it's either going to happen on a much larger sort of like enterprise level for bigger brands to be involved, or it'll just happen in the way that like Napster just happened, you know what I mean? Or whatever, and MP3s just happened. Like, I don't know, some coder somewhere created it and it spread through the hacker world or the indie world or whatever it was. So I think you can go one of two paths. Cool. Any other questions here? Is there anything that you all are excited about that you've seen? Like, one of the reasons I love doing these talks is just to get the perspective of up and coming creators, students, etc., and just kind of hear what their, what's caught their attention recently or whatnot. The older I get, the harder it is for me to like stay on the pulse of what's dope.
We have some typing.
Yeah, I'm seeing some typing going on.
Well, I don't think I've heard of Afterworld. Let me take a peek.
I have not actually. Janie, real quick, you said I'm interested in everything, just not where to start. To be completely honest, that was me. Like, that was me 20 years ago. It might still be me now. I'm entering a point in my career where I'm like really thinking about like what's the chapter 2 of my career, and I think that's okay. And for me, I was interested in everything, and theoretically that could make you a good producer because you could bring multiple kind of departments or crafts together and things like that. And when you say don't know where to start, just start somewhere. Like, and what I'll say is this is just like, it's okay to do it badly. Just start somewhere so you can learn. And worst case, you'll learn quickly that you don't like something and you can move on to a different craft,
This looks interesting.
I think Balenciaga is obviously like a dope brand, but also like a divisive brand. And I think they're intentionally divisive and they're like intentionally a bit like they're like being a provocateur is like built into their brand or whatever. And what I'll say is I think it's been dope that they've been doing a lot of experimenting kind of in emerging spaces. Nathan, could you save that YouTube link, the Afterworld one for us, and can we check that out in one of our team meetings later?
For sure.
Cool. All right, gang. Well, like I said, feel free to reach out through the residencies kind of management to with any questions. I can't promise when, but I'm happy to I'm always pretty happy to schedule 25 minutes for like one-on-ones and stuff like that in the future. Even if it happens to fall outside of the end date of the residency or whatever, happy to help out if we can. Or I'm sure Nathan or Tori would be also. So definitely feel free to reach out. Valencia. Oh, the other thing I'll say about Unreal is like they have literally and Yinga, feel free to also drop if you want. Those two are great, and those are great ways of getting in touch with me. But also feel free to drop my LinkedIn if you want. The Unreal is literally has an entire team that's devoted to getting the technology out there when it comes to using it as an animation engine. So they're always looking for cool projects and stuff. So you guys should do some research there and check out their socials and stuff. I promise I'm not paid by Unreal or anything either. I'm just it's helped me so much in our projects and stuff like that. And, obviously it cuts down a lot of stuff like render time, which is just a nightmare when you're in production. So yeah, and there's Nathan's stuff over there too. And then Nathan, if you want to drop Tori's LinkedIn too, feel free to reach out to like any of us. Cool. I will kind of start to disconnect, but I'll stay logged on here for like 2 minutes. Just on mute, just in case any last questions come up.
Very much. Thank you so much for doing this session with us and kindly volunteering your time and interest afterwards for any questions as well. Thank you very, very, very much. And thank you very much for the links. I'll put them. Is it okay for me to put them into the description of the YouTube video as well?
Totally. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Quick question, do you guys post the YouTube videos raw, or do you do a little editing before you put them up?
I can do a bit of editing as well. Usually what I do is I do transcribe it and then just put the
Great.
captions on, and then that's pretty much all I do. If there's anything specific you want, I can always post it unlisted first. You can have a little run through of it, and we can take out anything you need.
Yeah, if we could do that, Nathan, Tori, if you guys could just schedule yourself a work session to watch the raw video, and just you guys know if there's anything that should be edited out or anything like that, or awkward or whatever. But I'm pretty comfortable with just putting it out as is.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you everyone for being here, and if anybody's got any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. This is an awesome way to wrap up the week.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Peace.